morning, Trinity friends, and welcome to Adult Forum for this Sunday. We're so thankful that you're here with us. For those of you who have been with us each and every week, you know, as part of our series on the baptismal covenant, we have been taking one of the questions each and every week and discussing it in depth, often in conversation. We've talked about some of our kind of favorite baptismal covenant promises that we make to respect the dignity of every human being, to love our neighbor as ourselves, to proclaim the good news of God and Christ, to continue in the apostles' teaching and the prayers and the breaking of bread. And these are all kind of positive, happy even, challenging for sure, but definitely more on the positive side of the covenant promises that we make. Today, we dive into the murkier side of humanity when we talk about this final question from the covenant. Will you persevere in resisting evil? And whenever you fall into sin, repent and return to the Lord. You can tell why I actually couldn't find anybody to talk with me about this particular one. So I'm taking it on myself today. It's a wonderful question. It's a wonderful covenantal promise for so many reasons. Even though it might make us squirm a little bit, it does recognize that evil and sin are real in the world, and it calls us to deal with it. But it's not one that we tend to hear preached on all that often. You know, whenever I've heard sermons and even given sermons on the baptismal covenant, they tend to be on some of those more pleasant aspects about respecting the dignity of every human being, or preaching the good news, or being faithful in the prayers. It's not often we talk about resisting evil in the pulpit. It's not often we talk about evil in the pulpit itself. So today we're going to dive in with both feet. And I love the way the baptismal covenant actually frames this question for us, because it can be daunting to begin to think about evil. But the baptismal covenant positions this idea of resisting evil as a sacramental grace. It's a matter of grace that flows out of our experience of grace. It flows out of that experience of grace in baptism itself and with God's ongoing merciful forgiveness of us. You know, all these other vows that I mentioned and that we've talked about tend to be based in what we're doing rather than in what God is doing. We're going to proclaim the gospel. We're going to serve others. We're going to respect the dignity. We're going to remain faithful in the prayers. This, however, is the only one of these vows that is explicitly centered in our experience of grace and forgiveness, because it assumes that we're going to fail at it, and it assumes that God is going to forgive us when we do. The assumption here is grace. Will you persevere in resisting evil? And whenever you fall into sin, it doesn't say if you fall into sin. It says whenever you fall into sin, will you repent and return to the Lord? So I think it's really important as we begin to talk about this heavy topic that we remember that fundamentally this is a covenantal promise of grace. So keep that in mind as we begin to explore some of this together. Whenever we talk about evil as people of faith, the question that often comes up is, why does a good God allow evil in the world? And theologians and scholars have spent reams and reams of paper and parchment trying to get to the bottom of this. But ultimately, Christianity doesn't offer an explanation for the evil in the world. It doesn't. You can't really find that. You got a lot of theories. But Christianity's answer, or Christianity's response to evil in the world, is the cross of Christ. That's the Christian answer to evil. It's the cross and it's the resurrection. Now, whenever we think about evil, whenever I talk about evil, there's certain images that tend to come to mind. They may be caricatures of evil, Dr. Evil, from the Austin Powers movie, Darth Vader from Star Wars, Lord Voldemort from Harry Potter, or Freddy Krueger from the Friday the 13th series. These are scary figures. They might have given you nightmares as a kid. They might have kept you up at night. But ultimately, these kind of caricatures of evil, where you have this really big bad guy, I think are actually kind of comforting. There's a reason why we tend to create these characters. And there's a reason why when we talk about evil, we tend to focus on similar type characters in the real world. Truly awful and bad folks who do truly awful and evil things in the world. They're real life villains. People like Adolf Hitler, King Herod, as you see here in the picture, or Emperor Nero. These are what I call apex evil. They're the culmination of a long line of evil. And when we focus on that apex of evil, we can be both comforting and daunting and paralyzing all at the same time. It's daunting and paralyzing because we think, what can we do as individuals about such large, huge problems of evil? And it can also lead us to that comfort of theodicy, of indicting God and saying, God's to blame for what's wrong in the world. And it can be used as almost an excuse for our apathy, rather than encouraging us to persevere in resisting evil. I remember many years ago when I went to Auschwitz and Birkenau, that kind of paralyzing nature of large-scale evil became really clear, because standing there amidst the 472 acres of this horrible death camp, I was just numbed by the sheer scope of that evil. The acreage of evil was just overwhelming to see. But there was a process that led up to that. Auschwitz and Birkenau didn't just happen. It started with mundane examples of evil, and it started with ordinary people. There's a book called Vessels of Evil that explores the nature of evil. It's by Lawrence Mordecai Thomas. And he's got this great quote that I think is helpful when we think about what our role is in resisting evil in the world, and not to get distracted by those apex villains and evil. Thomas writes, while there are those whose lives seem to be the very embodiment of evil, Nero and Adolf Hitler, and they come readily to mind, it must be acknowledged that evil can be perpetrated by individuals who were once ordinary people, and that is morally decent people like you and me. Any satisfactory view of evil must make sense of this. Ordinary people, though open to moral criticism in many ways, would not imagine themselves participating in evil institutions. And I think that's the challenge of this particular baptismal covenant, is it forces us to take a really good look at ourselves and our immediate environment around us. I think it can be really convenient and comfortable to think of only those conceived in the very womb of evil could have acted in evil ways. It kind of absolves us of some of the small evils that might lead up to those. So how do we account for ordinary, morally decent people getting swept up in the social tides of evil in our world, which has happened kind of time and time again? A good example as a way to kind of demystify evil is a book called Ordinary Men by Christopher Browning. And what he did is he took just an ordinary group, a reserve battalion of soldiers, reserve police officers actually, from Germany, and cataloged and chronicled how they slowly got pulled in to the genocide of Jewish people in Europe. And he points out some really unsettling facts about these people who would end up becoming executioners and the foot soldiers of the Holocaust. They were middle-aged men. They were middle-class Germans. They weren't They weren't generally radicalized Nazis. And on the first night that they were to execute Jews, the commander was upset and distraught. And so he gave everyone an invitation to opt out. And very, very few did. It points out that evil needs a system of support, a process called dehumanization. Evil also needs kind of the social pressure to conform and to go along. Often, evil will prey on actually good values to accomplish evil ends. Many of the ordinary men in this police battalion talked about what made them stay was they felt a sense of loyalty, not to Hitler or to the Germans or to the Nazis. They felt loyalty to their fellow soldiers who were going to have to go through this. Evil exploited their camaraderie, their friendships, their relationships for the worst possible reasons and for the worst possible results. But to even make that possible, you have to have that infrastructure of evil, which is the process of dehumanization. A philosopher and researcher named David Livingston Smith wrote a book on this process called Less Than Human. And he writes and he argues pretty convincingly that barring actual psychopathy, harm and cruelty are actually very difficult for human beings. Studies show that prosocial behaviors is how we come to power in groups, and as highly social creatures, we as humans tend to resist harming other humans. And in order to do harm, we often have to undergo a process of dehumanization, of not ourselves, but of dehumanizing others. It's this internal process, not an external process, that paves the way for some of the worst evils in history. It's a matter of the heart. Dehumanization overcomes the natural barriers because we are led to believe that certain groups are different from us, and so that they can be conceived of as subhuman, even if they appear to be human. And the goal of dehumanization is to normalize cruelty. So the unthinkable and the conceivable becomes conceivable to ordinary moral people. And typically it begins with rhetoric, just pure and simple rhetoric, that our words wind up creating our worlds. Dehumanization is not a new process, Caesar. It dates all the way back to the ancient world. This is actually part of our history as human beings. And when we've been confronted with differences in our globalizing world, it's almost that dehumanization has the chance to be exponentially fast-tracked because our ethnocentrism, our in-group bias, is a part of our human nature. It was part of our survival as humans. Anthropologists talked about when he would go and visit some of more primitive tribes in his research, he would say that they regarded me as subhuman or inhuman, and they treated me very badly. Eventually, as he got to know them and built relationships with them, they began to tell him, almost as though it were an admission, you are almost a human being. You are almost one of us. So this idea that all groups have this bias to view our group as the humans and your group as subhumans. Christianity, of course, calls us to view the entire human family as part of God's family. So within Christianity itself, it has this bias against dehumanizing others. What makes all this so difficult and tricky is because evil does exploit our human nature to create evil that often will masquerade as a moral good. Many of the people who perpetrate, many of the ordinary everyday people who have perpetrated profound evil in the world thought that they were protecting their country, thought that they were protecting their families and their friends from, evil hordes or people bent on destroying their civilizations. You can kind of catalog how that has happened. You can set up some of the atrocities of our modern world and see where the dehumanization began to lay that groundwork. So you've got what happened to the indigenous people in the US and how they were called savages, or slavery in the US, and how African slaves were called cattle or beasts or animals. In the Holocaust, you had Jewish folks being called rats. In the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, on both sides, you've got them calling each other dogs. In the Rwandan genocide, you've got them calling each other cockroaches. In Abu Ghraib, you had American soldiers calling prisoners dogs. Dehumanization breaks down those barriers. I think those God-given barriers that call us to treat each other with dignity. So these violent acts that happen in the world, they're not the dehumanization itself. They're the culmination of the process of dehumanization. Now, dehumanization doesn't always lead to genocide or to mass violence. That should be clear. But dehumanization is necessary anytime there's genocide or mass violence. It's the infrastructure, it's the engine, and it's the lubrication by which it happens. So when we pull back the lens, we can look at evil, and it can seem paralyzing and overwhelming to think of, oh my gosh, there's evil in the world, and what can little old me in Asheville, North Carolina do about it? But when we begin to break it down, we see that this massive evil is the result of evil and grows out of evil that starts with something as simple as name calling. Again, I go back to Lawrence Mordecai Thomas's book, Vessels of Evil. It says, extraordinary resolve is not generally necessary in order to steer clear of the social tides of evil. As Aristotle clearly and rightly saw, we are morally responsible for the wrong that we do, not so much because at the time of our actions we are capable of acting differently, but because at an earlier point we were capable of acting differently. So it's not just if we're supposed to resist evil, but when we're supposed to resist evil. That's why I love that the prayer book calls us to persevere in it. It's an ongoing resistance that we're always supposed to be aware of and on the lookout for, not just when it gets big and overwhelming. Now, as people of faith, our faith says a lot about the process of dehumanization, although it doesn't use those words. Jesus actually talks about it on the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus said, you've heard it said that in ancient times you shall not murder, and whoever murders shall be liable to judgment. But I say to you that if you're angry with a brother or sister, you're liable to judgment. And if you insult a brother or sister, you'll be liable to the council. And if you say, you fool, you'll be liable to the hell of fire. It's almost as if Jesus sees that this subtle process of dehumanization really can have a profoundly awful effect in our world. Again, Jesus tells us that we've heard it said that you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy, but I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. In each of these cases, Jesus sets out the way that we're to resist evil and persevere in resisting evil. And that's by persevering in humanizing each other, even our enemies. That's hard work. That's really hard work. Dehumanization makes us look at sin, I think, in a more complex way, and it aligns us with the higher demands of the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus is often referred to as the Son of God, but also as the Son of Man, or if we put it in more gender-neutral terms, the Son of Humanity. And as we look at the story of Jesus, he is constantly doing this work of humanizing others for people who are angry at them. Jesus humanizes God, first of all. Jesus is God incarnate. He humanizes God. Jesus humanizes the demon-possessed man. He humanizes the sinner and the outcast, the prostitute and the tax collectors. He humanizes the occupying Roman centurions, the bad guys to many Jewish people. He humanizes the religious leaders. He humanizes Zacchaeus, a tax collector who was a collaborator with the Roman occupying armies. Jesus humanizes his torturers. and as executioners at the very end, and he asks that God would forgive them. Each of these people, and in some of these cases, these folks were actively dehumanizing Jesus or others, particularly on the cross. Jesus is being dehumanized. But Jesus sees that even those who commit dehumanizing evil doesn't rob the perpetrator of their humanity. Nothing can make us subhuman or not human. We often will hear people talk about, he's just not human, or that's so inhuman. Really, that's another process of dehumanization. So as we begin to kind of sum up this idea of resisting evil, it's a heart matter. It begins as a heart matter. The biggest evils in the world really do begin as that heart matter. Dehumanization is an internal process. It's a heart process. And we can combat that by actively humanizing each other. And we often need to do that through education, through proximity and relationship. It's a call to question our in-group, to intentionally humanize, and to identify dehumanization early, especially in vulnerable populations, and to speak up when we see it happen. That's part of how we're to resist evil. So a good question to start out with, perhaps, if it is an internal process, is to ask ourselves, as a way of exploring this baptismal promise, who do we find it easiest to dehumanize? If I were to bet right now in our world, folks find it easiest to dehumanize the other political party. We see a lot of that going on right now. And part of the call is to resist that, because right now that dehumanizing language is breaking down the barriers, our natural God-given barriers that resist causing harm and violence towards our fellow humans. So part of it is to resist that dehumanizing language and perspectives and attitudes towards those we find on the other side of an issue, of an identity. So the last thing I'll say as I close is that we're not going to be perfect in this. We're going to mess up. We're going to slip up. We are going to sin. And thanks be to God, our baptismal covenant recognizes us. Our baptismal covenant actually humanizes us as well by allowing us the human space to sin, to mess up, and then to be forgiven for it. None of us need to feel guilty for the ways that we've been complicit in it, responsible. But the baptismal covenant calls us to fearlessly examine ourselves, our communities, and our world, because we're assured of forgiveness. And we're called to persevere in resisting evil. So, blessings on you. I hope that you have a very happy Thanksgiving and that you're safe in all that you do, and that God will bring us back together soon. All right, Noah, bye-bye.